Representative, National Association of Black Police of America. Brother Ron, you're now in charge.
All right, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, let me express my appreciation for the opportunity to lead this discussion, something that is near and dear and close to my heart. Part of the, I say it's part of the mission of the work that I've been doing all these years. And I also get to do it with these individuals, these very, very talented, very good-looking women this morning, of which I've had the pleasure of working with over the years, too. But I just want to straighten out one thing. I know they said that I was with the National Association of Black Police of America. This is a combination of some, for years I was the executive director of the National Black Police Association, which I retired from without pay, without a pension, but with plenty of experience. But now I've had the pleasure for the last 3 or 4 years of working with an organization out of Mount Vernon, New York, upstate New York, called the Blacks in Law Enforcement of America, which represent about 300 men and women in law enforcement, as well as corrections and other components of the criminal justice system too. So you know, the struggle continues. I didn't have the luxury of just stepping down and sitting at home, wanting to continue to do the work. And Decent Justice Collaborative was one of the ways of continuing that work. This morning we're going to the overall title is Overcoming the New Jim Crow, but we're going to be talking about part 1, which is the impact of the racially biased policies on black families and communities. And we have with us 3 individuals who will talk with us about this issue and the impact of it from their perspective, from the work that they've been doing. I wanted to sort of put it in some kind of context because it was devastating what the war on drugs did. I served on the Metropolitan Police Department from 1970 to 1994. And at a time in our city, someone yesterday mentioned Operation Clean Sweep. Well, I was on the police department when Operation Clean Sweep was conducted. And you could visibly see the impact of it every single day in our district. And I was assigned to the 3rd district, where it mainly took place. It was uptown, 16th Street, 14th Street, the historical black Renaissance area of Washington, D.C. And I watched the devastation of it after Clean Sweep and the rest of the drug policy practices that took place in our city. But more importantly, at the end of Clean Sweep, I was able to look at where people like the ACLU, other criminal justice organizations looked at the results and what was the impact of locking up 53,000 people in less than a year's time. We know that the impact directly affected those that were arrested. You could go down to the arraignment court in the basement level or the JM level at the courthouse and see if 10 people passed the judge in the morning, 9 of them walked out. They didn't hold them because the charges were false from the very beginning. They set up roadblocks in particular areas of the city and arrested people for a variety of things. Very little of those charges had to do with drugs. They were other traffic offenses, urinating in public, drinking in public, all of these kinds of things. And it was merely a political ploy to give whoever was running for mayor and the city council at that time an opportunity to say that they were doing something about the so-called crack problem, drug problem in Washington, D.C. It devastated families because they were taking breadwinners, individuals who got locked up and arrested, therefore couldn't get jobs. A whole host of things were affected as a result of it. I remember at that time going into the 90s in the Clinton administration where new policies around living in public housing were created. And so again, the family was affected by all of those. So it was a variety of things. And the city today, there's still places in the city that are left over as a result of the impact of the war on drugs, the jump out squad, cameras on poles, cameras on vans. They actually set up trailers in communities. I know there was a trailer at 7th and T, and they claimed that there were cameras in the trailer that shined out on the street that would pick up people and their actions, and then they had police officers on the inside. And most of the days they were just jobbing, wasn't no cameras on, it wasn't nothing else, but that was the BS that they were selling to people in the community. So it would somehow or another prevent them from doing whatever it was that they was doing. But they would come through there and make arrests based on that story, even though they didn't have cameras. And they were very brutal in terms of the arrests and how they took place too, slamming people on the sidewalk and all those things. And I can say today, and quite proud to say, that I didn't participate in those things because I refused to be a police officer who was involved in those kind of things, because I thought that there were other things that we could do. As a matter of fact, I was working with the ACLU, I was working with Nkechi and
back when I used to work for them.
yeah, right. I was working with the Lawyers Committee, Amnesty International, to turn in those people because I didn't want that to happen in my community, and I had a role to play. Some of my colleagues used to call me the citizen police officer. I thought that's what I was anyway. Police officers are citizens. That's a good thing. That's my job. And I didn't make any friends, and that was all right because, you know, it was important. The work that we was doing was important enough that we worked with organizations. And I could just say on the side of that, that's why I believe that the collaborative effort, Ron, is an important one because it brings us all together on this work, and every little bit that we're able to do is valued and important in our community. So that's just a sort of a little bit about what happened in our city to set in place the context for the discussion. So what I'm going to do is probably start on maybe my right, and then we'll go to the left, and just talk about, from your perspective, the work that you've been doing both now and in the past, pointing out how it impacted on our families and the devastation of it, and sort of where we are today in reference to it. And then in the second part, we'll talk about where do we go from here, because that's an important conversation, because there are some things that are taking place in our communities and in our organizations to sort of begin to rebuild, reinvest with encouragement, the kind of things that we need to be doing in our community. So first of all, we're going to hear from Jesslyn McCurdy, who is a lawyer but also a senior legislative counsel with the ACLU in Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much, Ron.
Mike.
Actually, just wanted to ask Nkechi, did you want to go ahead and show
Did you?
the PowerPoint to
I
give
do.
kind of some to
Want
frame
to
the
do that?
discussion?
Set the frame.
Okay. Yeah,
All right, that'll be
yeah,
it. See, I can be led. It's important to be able to be led.
it's 3-1, Ron.
Okay, I will do that, thank you. And, you know, I know it's so
You want to
loud,
stand?
that's why
I know you want to.
I might take this to here, if this works. Oh, did my techie have the clicker thing?
You got it, well, no, but we don't have a clicker.
Okay.
Okay.
Next page.
So just say we.
Next page. Next slide.
You want to stay there?
Right there, arrow,
Okay,
arrow there.
okay. She's stuck.
Okay, well, you know, we're very flexible, right, and I didn't really come prepared to do this, but someone who was at the last Justice Collaborative, Dr. Keith Hunter, Gerard Hunter, has a series in Washington called Education or Incarceration, and a couple of weeks ago, I did a little presentation for them. They really give a kind of overview of the system, but actually this was really something I did for IBW and Metropolitan Church when we were talking about 50 years of the criminal justice system. So I'm going to go through it very quickly, and I'm going to skip some of the things as well, but I just think it might be good to help give a little view or perspective. Okay, so
Where'd he go? You gotta help her move.
yeah.
I got you. Go ahead.
Okay, well, let's go on, let's move it, yeah. Yeah, so basically, the question I really want to pose to all of us here is, during this whole time frame, are we talking about justice, or are we talking about just us? Let's keep going on. So, 50 years ago, Commissioner of Public Safety Bill Connor used fire hoses and police dogs to control black demonstrators and their allies. Was it justice or was it just us? Keep going. That same year saw a hung jury in the trial of the person Byron D. Beckwith, who viciously gunned down Medgar Evers in his own driveway. Was it justice or just us? Keep going on. That same year, we know about the 4 little girls who were bombed to bits in Sunday school. Justice or just us? Back then, the police and the Klan worked hand in hand. It was overt, it was direct, it was in your face. Today, we know about the Jim Crow laws, overt, in your face. 50 years later today, the United States has moved beyond overt racist lynchings and explicitly blatant discrimination as the order of the day to institutionalize mass incarceration as its punishment of choice. Indeed, prior to the advent of the civil rights laws of the 60s, mass incarceration was not a factor. Why? Why focus on a prison system when you have a lynching system? Why focus on due process of law when you have a fully functioning lynching system? In unabashedly provocative terms, a bird's eye view of the past 5 decades reveals, in my humble opinion, a seismic shift towards symptoms of genocide as the system of mass incarceration decimates not only individuals, and we talked about impact, not only individuals, but families, generations of black people as well. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the players change, but guess what? The scene remains the same. The script remains the same. Unequal justice. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about police vigilantism. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about prosecutorial abuse or court processing. As a race, blacks have been subjected to a double standard of justice. We know the names. We know the events, the groups. If you don't know any of these, we need to go to the internet. The Scottsboro Boys, Fannie Lou Hamer, Emmett Till, Black Panther Party, RNA 11, the Wilmington 10, Angela Davis, Attica, Mumia Abu Jamal, Eleanor Bumpers, Rodney King, Michael Stewart, Amadou Diallo, Edna Luima, Johnny Garrett, Kimmy Smith, Julia Texas, Jenna Six, Troy Davis, Scott Sisters, Oscar Grant, Trayvon Martin, Marissa Alexander, and I forgot the name of the sister who was asking for directions and got gunned down. We were saying her name yesterday. Jordan Davis. I ask you, IBW, you tell me, has it been justice or has it been just us? Each of those above cases could have been the spark for a critical examination and restructuring of the U.S. system of justice because the linkages are legion. Today, Jenna seems like a distant echo, doesn't it? The Scott sisters received double life sentences, each for an alleged robbery that netted only $11, although released, their cases are nearly forgotten. The brutal Rodney King police beating occurred before some of us in this room were even born. And Tulia, although I know I always characterize it as a tip of the drug war iceberg, seems an issue of the past. I don't know if you all remember that Jenna case. If you remember what the prosecutor said when he addressed the young people in the office, he said, in the audience, he said, with a stroke of my pen, I can make your lives disappear. That's what he said. And I never forgot that because it was so very true. It was the stroke of the prosecutor's pen that caused domestic violence survivor Kimber Smith, who never touched any drugs, to be sentenced to 24 and a half years in prison on crack cocaine conspiracy charges. It was the stroke of the prosecutor's pen that sent the recently college degree Garrison twins to prison for nearly 2 decades, each on nonviolent charges. It was the stroke of the prosecutor's pen, the same prosecutor that tried Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman. It was her pen that recently tried to revoke bail for Marissa Alexander. Okay, that's all right. Marissa Alexander, Jordan Dunn cases have once again shown a spotlight on issues at the juncture of race and justice. Today, the U.S. holds the dubious distinction of having the highest incarceration rate in the world. With over 2 million people behind bars, a 500% increase over the past 30 years. A primary driver of this shameful and destructive statistic is the disproportionate representation and unequal treatment faced by blacks at each stage of the criminal justice continuum, whether we're talking about stops and arrests, premised on racially discriminatory profiling, whether we're talking about police conduct and brutality, whether we're talking about the abuse of prosecutorial discretion in charging decisions, whether we're talking about a skewed system of plea bargaining. I mean, that's a whole presentation in and of itself. Whether we're talking about the lack of diversity in jury pools, the improper use of peremptory challenges to remove blacks from juries, harsh, rigid, unconscionably lengthy mandatory minimum sentence. I mean, unconscionably lengthy. I mean, does it take 24 and a half years?
Right.
Even if she had been guilty to teach somebody a lesson. We have become numb to these sentences, and when we talk about impact, what does it do when someone's in prison? Andrea James said yesterday she spent 2 years in prison, when in there was all of the different support systems that you can imagine, from family to, you name it, came out with those same support systems. Yet in spite of all of that, she couldn't get off the couch for a year. What does that do to people who does not have the support that Andrea James, a lawyer, had? I mean, the impact is just absolutely, and it's these long sentences. There's a case in Maryland now. I don't know if you all know the Unger case, U-N-G-E-R. If anybody knows former Black Panther Marshal Eddie Conway, did we know? Most of us don't know. Marshal Conway, convicted of killing a police officer. People convicted of killing police officers, whether they're innocent or guilty, Abu Jamal, do not leave prison. Right. They do not. Right. He walked out of prison a couple of years ago as a result of a case. What did I say? A couple of years. Oh man, a couple of weeks ago. Oh my God, we're talking about long, lengthy sentences, but he's been in prison over 40 years. What type of support mechanisms, are there for people coming out of prison? I forgot my train where I had started with Eddie Conway, but that was just a little aside. We need to celebrate these. When we have them, but we need to make sure that when people come out, they have the supports that are necessary, Tyrone, that will allow them to survive and allow them to thrive. We're talking about legalized discriminatory treatment in employment, education, housing, public benefits, the franchise based on one's former felony status. We're talking about the prison industrial complex. This really represents, again, just the tip of the iceberg, as the military-industrial complex of yesterday has morphed into a lucrative and disturbingly profitable prison-industrial complex today, where the deprivation of liberty is powered in large part by what? By the profit motive. When I used to work for the ACLU, Ron, back in the early 90s, when we were dealing with those whole huge, ridiculous crime bills, I saw a newspaper article where there was a prominent securities analyst in Virginia who was combing through every single detail of the crime bill of 1994, and he came up with what he called a list of theme stocks for the 90s. And what do you think his #1 recommendation went to? CCA, the Corrections Corporation of America. CCA, at that time, the highest, the largest private, operator of private prisons. And CCA's chief financial officer was quoted saying that, quote, "The crime bill was very favorable to us." I was shocked. Why? Yeah. Because you have a situation where the deprivation of liberty is powered by the profit motive. We have a situation where prison business may seek to maintain high occupancy rates, even in the absence of demonstrated need. You see, the private prison industry has economic interest in keeping these sentences long, keeping them harsh, so that prison populations continue to soar. And the scary thing about the industry is that it has no interest in its own abolition. Okay, common sense dictates that from an economic point of view, the more prisoners, the more profit.
Yeah.
From a management point of view, a prison can be characterized like a hotel or a motel. You need to fill every single bed every night.
Right.
And if you don't have enough gas, you do whatever you can to make sure
Right.
that you can fill it up, which also includes lobbying for more and longer and harsher mandatory minimum sentences. Again, we're talking about the profit incentive to build prisons,
Yeah.
increase arrests, and extend prison. Do you know that this speculative prison building based on the test scores
Yes.
of black boys in the 3rd grade? There is little incentive to rehabilitate. Every bit of profit motive, again, to arrest more people, convict more people, and incarcerate more people and for longer periods of time. And this whole out of control, which I know Jesslyn's going to talk about, this out of control growth of the federal prison population is forcing cuts in education and job training and other social services, the very programs that address the root causes of crime. I'm going to kind of skip this part because this is the part we're going to talk about in the second part in terms of the laws and the legislations and just what can be done to seek to ameliorate all of this. I'm not going to go into that right now because we're going to kind of be dealing with that in the second part. But just going on, you know, when you look through the past 50 years, we see that the 70s brought the Supreme Court ruling that the death penalty was not unconstitutional, reinstating states' ability to execute. The 80s for shepherding the war on drugs, which in practice, as IBW has made very clear on at dinner tables and at family reunions and all of, making sure that people understand that the war on drugs is a war on us. It's not just people in Washington saying this. This is something that's really thanks to DPA and IBW really getting this word out. It brought in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which grossly differentiated between crack and powder cocaine and sentencing, instituted broad conspiracy provisions. Andrea talked about someone who just made a couple of trips with some drugs for some kingpin boyfriend or whatever. Because it was conspiracy, gets tagged with the whole amount of the drugs. Kimber Smith, 24 and a half years because it was conspiracy. You might have just made a telephone call. You might have just done this. Just little minor stuff under the conspiracy laws brings you within the ambit of the system. And many of these people are low level, many of them nonviolent. And the end of the decade ushered in a proliferation of metal detectors and school resource officers in many schools. Was Kenny Braswell, you know, the first step down that slippery slope of the school to prison pipelines. And it was during the 80s that the prison population exceeded the million mark. And then we had the 90s and the crime bill that I talked about. That crime bill had the largest expansion of the death penalty in modern time. It had slew upon slew upon slew upon slew of mandatory minimum sentences. It had the institution of the federal 3 strikes laws. It had the trying of 13-year-olds as adults. It had the refusal to address the crack powder cocaine disparities, and it had more money, more money, more money, more money, as Michelle Alexander points out in her book, more money to build more and more prisons in exchange for the adoption of measures that keep people in prison again for longer and longer periods of time. And then at the turn of the century, we saw that the prison population had risen to 1.4 million people incarcerated, and today, over 2 million people behind bars, okay? But it also saw that those people who were sentenced to these unconscionably lengthy sentences during the 80s and 90s were beginning to return home, beginning to come back, be released after being serving 10, 15, 20, 25 years behind bars, finding themselves confronted with just a plethora of obstacles and discriminatory barriers to successful reentry in society. I just say, as I'm coming to a close, that, you know, it's really past time that we really confront the disastrous policies of the past half century.
Yes, yes.
Trust me.
Yes, yes.
this country's mammoth experiment, and it was experiment. Unfortunately, it was an experiment done on our backs, or the backs of our people in our community. But this country's mammoth experiment in mass incarceration has been an abysmal failure, producing conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a race. Yesterday, Ron Daniels was quoting his own paper when he was talking about the calculation. It was calculated, okay? Kudos to Michelle Alexander for popularizing the analogy of today's system of mass incarceration with earlier systems of social control, such as Jim Crow. Yes, we are talking about the institutionalization of second-class citizenship once one is released from prison. Yes, we are talking about disparate treatment and profiling and arrests and sentences. But we may also be talking about the possible extermination of generations as well.
Yes.
Perhaps, just perhaps, we need to take just a peek at the stark correlation between the internationally accepted definition of genocide and the juxtaposition of that definition against the impact of the new Jim Crow in the criminal punishment system, which includes not only killing members of a group, but also causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group. Inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction in whole or in part. Forcibly transferring children from one group to the other, taking measures to prevent births within the group. That is the internationally accepted definition, which the United States has adopted and codified into law. Many people do not realize this. That is the definition of genocide, and we need to start using that. I submit that perhaps this heightened nomenclature will shock the public's conscience, and it is shocking because people don't like, you don't want to put those two words together, genocide and black people. That, you know, that's shocking to the conscience. But perhaps using these terms will shock the public's conscience into sparking a real revolution in criminal justice policies and practice, as opposed to yet another shift in focus to a still newer system of control. Perhaps we need to push the envelope a bit further and ask, can the United States government abide by the mandates that a global framework to justice issues presents, or are we once again relegated to Dred Scott justice, where the human rights of African-descended people are not bound to be respected? So I'm going to go on and stop right there. I think I just laid out a couple of little points that we can okay, but thank you.
As we move to Jessica, as you can see, why it was important to work with people like Nkechi coming up, because a few points turned into a sheer foundation for the work that we need to be doing, because it lays out our case for the things that are happening in our criminal justice system. A system that is calculated, that has created mass incarceration in our communities and the devastation of it in our communities. So we'll go ahead with
that. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, first of all, let me say I think you just went to church. If you didn't know anything about the criminal justice system or thought you knew something about the criminal justice system, you just learned a lot from Nkechi, Taifa, this morning. Thank you so much, Nkechi. It's really not a lot more to say, but I want to thank Ron, Dr. Daniels, and of course Rosalind, because for lighting the fire under my butt to make sure I got here today. None of us would be here without Rosalind. So I want to thank you, and as you know, I always enjoy, anytime I can get to a IBW event, I always am here, because these are the discussions that we need to be having as this community, as the black community together. And sometimes we need to be in a room by ourselves with the shades down and the lights off to have these discussions, because this is serious business, because people in our community, as Michelle Alexander has so brilliantly laid out in this book, I'm assuming everybody has read it, but if you have not, this is the seminal book in the criminal justice community about the criminal justice system, and you must read it. You must read it to do this work. If you did not think it was just us, Michelle Alexander lays out the case in this book from the beginning of the system to the end of the system that it is just us. She does it by talking about how the elimination of the Jim Crow segregation system has now been replaced by the Jim Crow criminal justice mass incarceration system in this country. And that is for real. That is true. This is, I think this says it all, actually. And it's just one sentence in her book. On page 6, the very beginning, it says the United States imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. Let me read that one more time, because that is deep. The United States imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. I think that really says it all.
Right.
But the discussion we need to be having today, or we hopefully will be having today, is how do we undo this overwhelming, out of control, racially discriminatory system that has resulted in so many black people in this country at the end of the criminal justice system being incarcerated. One of the reasons why we are in this situation is because this country is addicted to incarceration. It is addiction. I mean, if you look at all the symptoms of an addiction, it is an addiction. Even when you try to stop yourself from whatever you are addicted from, you continue to do more things to add to that addiction. This country is addicted to incarceration. And particularly when the face of incarceration looks like us. It's easier to ignore the addiction and not deal with the addiction when the face of incarceration looks like black folks. And that's the reality of incarceration in this country. 38% of the people who are in prisons in this country are black. We only make up 12% of the population. Only 35% of the people that are in prisons and jails in this country are white. How does that imbalance happen? Well, I think one thing we're going to talk about today in this discussion and throughout is that the policies that are adopted in this country, that's how that imbalance happens. That's how we get to a point where in the federal prison system, against on the issue of the war on drugs, 50% of the people that are in federal prison are in federal prison for drug offenses. Many of which, the majority of which, are nonviolent drug offenses. There was no violence associated. They are serving, as Nkechi said, long, harsh sentences you wouldn't believe. People that do this work, even oftentimes when I talk to Nkechi and I talk to her about, the ACLU just did a recent report on life without parole. And what we found is in the federal system alone, there are close to 2,000 people who are serving life without parole sentences for non-violent offenses. Non-violent, many drug offenses, non-violent offenses. They're in for life. About 1,500 in the state system, 2,000 in the federal system. Several of those people, President Obama recently commuted their sentence, but only 8, very small number. Hopefully, we're hoping that's the beginning of a sea change in terms of how the president is looking at these criminal justice issues. We've seen recently, Attorney General Eric Holder has stepped out there, really out there on a limb. And if you think about it in the context of the backlash that he has been fighting since the beginning of the administration in terms of the Republicans, almost on a daily basis, asking for his resignation. But he stepped out there this summer and said, enough is enough. He and the department's policies, the Justice Department policies, in his mind basically said, are not going to continue to contribute to this crisis of mass incarceration, particularly on the federal level. That's something that he really has control over. and that he was going to change the way, he was going to rethink the way that he charged drug cases, again, because 50% of the population in the federal system are drug cases. He was going to stop or have his prosecutors evaluate when they charge people with mandatory minimums, because the research shows that mandatory minimums are driving the fact that we have now 216,000 people in the federal prison system. It's the largest prison system in this country. Again, 50% are drug offenses. And he's looking, has changed the policies in terms of how prosecutors, because again, as Nkechi talked about in the Gina 6 case, in the context of Gina 6 case, prosecutors have all control. So the prosecutors can charge you with one crime that doesn't have a mandatory minimum, or they can charge you with another crime that does have a mandatory minimum. They have all the control. Judges, once they charge you with, for example, a mandatory minimum case, the judges don't have any discretion in terms of what sentence you get. So oftentimes what they do is threaten you with a mandatory minimum sentence to get you what they call to cooperate or assist them with their case. And they say then we will charge you, or we will recommend that you get another sentence if you assist us with our case. Now, to assist prosecutors with their case, you have to have something to assist them with. You have to have information. And the prosecutors are the ones that decide whether the information that you give them is worthy of you getting a cut on your sentence. So, so the system, and so what the Attorney General Holder is saying is, look, people who have very tangential, very low-level involvement in drug cases, we are no longer going to threaten them with the possibility of a mandatory minimum sentence. He didn't say you won't be charged with anything, which of course, you know, his critics will spin his speech around to try to say that. But he says we're gonna charge you with a more appropriate sentence for your conduct that has been involved in the case. And so that was historic. I mean, because what you really see from prosecutors and generally from the Department of Justice is that they want more and longer sentences. What he's saying is we're going to do this differently. We cannot sustain 216,000 people in the Federal Bureau of Prisons at a percentage of 32% over capacity. We can't sustain that. It takes up over 25% of the Department of Justice's budget. We can't sustain that. They can't sustain it fiscally, but we can't sustain it personally. We can't sustain it as a community, having that many people in prison. And this is why it's important to us, and this is why it has to be a priority for us to try to fight against these policies, to try to fight against the people who are holding on to dear life, to sustain these policies, to not re-look and rethink like Attorney General Holder has done, at these policies that are causing, again, our communities to be locked up and our communities to be a victim of this addiction to incarceration in this country. Because let me tell you, if there was 50% of the people in the Federal Bureau of Prisons that were white, we wouldn't be even having this conversation, okay? Right. Because there wouldn't even be an issue of an addiction to incarceration, okay? So they're not going to have the conversation for us. They're not going to stand up for our children. Right. They're not going to stand up for the men and women in our communities. We have to do that. It's not going to get done if we don't do that. So I'll end there for now, but I think we're going to come back later and talk more specifically, get more specifically into the policies that has us, the policies that exist now that we must address that have us in the situation that we are in now in this country.
Next we're going to hear from Yolande Cadore. She's the Director of Strategic Partnership at the Drug Policy Alliance.
Thank you. I feel like an infant in the midst of Nkechi and Jesslyn talking about drug policy reform and reforming the criminal justice system. So one of the things that I have the privilege of doing is working with organizations across the country who are doing this work on the ground, in the trenches, and figuring out ways to make sure that they are effective and they are efficient and they are building a movement where we have more better us so that we can fight the system. And more better us is a term McCurdy uses a lot to describe and boils down what it is we're doing when we say we're building a movement. But I can't, when Nkechi was presenting, I just couldn't resist, hearing Michelle Alexander's words that she mentioned 2 weeks ago in a conference call we did with her. And she evoked the idea of an ethics of care and admonished us to think about how we would treat people if we really cared about them. And I think that is so intertwined with the idea of redefining and restoring Black humanity, which I think is at the crux and so much at the core of what we're dealing with when we talk about the invisibility, and when we talk about if 50% of the people that are currently in the criminal justice system were white, that it would look different. We would have a different kind of policy approach. I think that is rooted in how we view Black humanity. And in this room, as a Black family, we have a responsibility to redefine what Black humanity means and to lift that up and make that an integral part of our struggle as we build movement, as we organize in communities across this country, that we lift up that Black lives matter. One of the things that Reverend Barber, who is leading Moral Mondays in North Carolina, now he's moving to Georgia and he's moving to Florida, mentioned in a conference I attended a few weeks ago, was that after every major civil rights win, there was a backlash. And he sort of lifted up that we were sort of in a third iteration of a backlash. After slavery, we had the Black Codes, we had New Jim Crow, after the civil rights win, we had everything that came with that, including mass incarceration. And now, with the election of President Obama, we are seeing the third, sort of the backlash related and connected to this third reconstruction. And I think part of claiming our struggles and claiming our victories is making sure that we build up a movement that is able to prevent those kinds of backlashes, because we keep fighting battles over and over and over again and not getting to what the things that are at the root of the system, and really and dismantling this system that Michelle Alexander so brilliantly characterized as the New Jim Crow system. So I know that Nkechi and Ron and Jesslyn are, they're the experts in talking about, the damages and the deleterious effect that the criminal justice system is having on Black lives and Black families. And the one piece of the work that I sort of carved out for myself at the Drug Policy Alliance to focus on is drug testing. Drug testing families so that they can eat, which I think is the most inhumane and one of the sort of the core of human rights violations. The human eating shouldn't be difficult, and that is the situation that we're creating for thousands of Black families across the country, where they cannot feed their families, and for them to do that, they have to pee in a cup. And, I just ask us to imagine, how dehumanizing that is, knowing that you have to pee in a cup to feed your child. Since 2011, we've seen almost a tripling in the number of states that are introducing legislation asking people who are receiving any types of government benefits to subject to drug testing. And we've worked a lot with the ACLU to really stop those bills. Stop them because they are unconstitutional, it's an illegal, it's a violation of the Fourth Amendment, but also it's just not right to do that. And it's fiscally inefficient. We know that the laws, once they are introduced and passed, they don't catch people. The people who are applying for government benefits, they're not drug users. They're not drug users.
And can I add, not only ask people to pee in a cup and drug test, but make them pay for it.
And you have to pay for it.
They have to pay for it.
Yes. So
And then if they turn up negative, then they get reimbursed their money.
That's right.
Now, these are people on public assistance. They have to pay for the drug test. Wait months if they're clear to get their money back.
To get their money back. And we're talking about $200, sometimes $200 a month that they're getting in government benefits. So that's one of the key policy areas that I think as the Black Family Summit and IBW that we should really pay attention to and lift it up as a key policy priority as we look at what it means to repair the harms done by the drug war, to repair the harms done by years and years and years of dehumanization, civil rights abuses. The other piece that my colleagues are starting to pay a lot of attention to, and we are hoping to lift it up as a policy priority, is the bail abuses. And a number of people, especially young Black men who are sitting in jails because they cannot afford bail. In New Jersey, our office there, they are leading an effort. There's a bill introduced to really stop it, to stop because it's also profiteering. And as Nkechi mentioned, all Black people are disadvantaged at every point in the system. There's also a profit at every point in the system, and the profits are being made on the backs and using the bodies of Black men and women. So if you are in a state, New Jersey is one of the states that has just severe abuses in their bail system. Chicago is another one. You have 10,000 people sitting in Cook County Jail right now simply because they cannot afford bail. And as a Black family, what is our responsibility to ensure that policies that keep folks in prison while all the other reforms are happening, that A.G. Holder and others, and we applaud the progress that they're making at the municipal level. There is so much innovation and so much reform that is necessary, that we also need to not just get caught up in sort of the macro changes, although they are important, but we also have to look at some of the micro things that could really transform the lives of people that we care about. And the third that I think really has some meaning for people in the room is the drug endangered child. And the number of Black children that are being removed from their families based on the perception of harm. And again, for the social workers and the psychologists in the room, we need guidance. The Drug Policy Alliance and groups like National Advocates for Pregnant Women and the ACL, we need you to step up and to tell us what harm is and to help define for it. So when we are meeting with legislators and when we are advocating, we can have a different definition of what it means to what harming a Black child or harming any children means, not having prosecutors and law enforcement officials make that determination and create that narrative for us about what it means for a child to be endangered. So I think those are the three pieces that we believe are core to the Black Family Summit and to folks in the room, that is not as sexy as the major changes that is happening at the federal level with President Obama and Attorney General Holder, but at the state and local level, we think that those are key priorities, key practices that are harming the Black family, and that we should be lifting them up and figuring out what are policy approaches, what are the alternatives, and what are the policy actions we need to take as a family to repair the harms done. As Michelle Alexander said last week, and just lightened up the room and gave me sort of new perspective that we have to start talking about reparations for the drug war and repairing the harms that has been done over the last 40 years.
Right.
Sitting here, a couple of examples have come to me, and I want to share those with you all. You know, after you reach a certain stage, sometimes you can't think of them at first, but later on, you know, they come to you. It's a senior moment. But this is some example of again of some of the devastating effects of it. I know in Michelle's book I was reading here, where she talks about race as a factor, and the police use race and have always used race as a factor in their decision making when it comes to arrest and enforcement strategies.
Right.
And I just want to give you a couple of examples that come to mind. And I know these are examples that happen in Washington, but they happen everywhere, whether it's Philadelphia, whether it's Chicago, Raleigh, North Carolina, other places. There was a club. It's no longer on South Capitol Street. It's called the Zambezi Club, and it was called the Zambezi Club because it was a black club, and they did what they do in black clubs, and they had good fun out there.
They do with black clubs.
They danced to Marvin Gaye's hour-long music, and they served food from the back, you know, chicken wings and all kind of good things. And of course, as we know, there would be someone in there lighting up a joint or either, you know, snorting some cocaine or something in the back. On the side, on the other side of town, there was Champions Club, which is a sports club in the back alley right there off of Wisconsin Avenue and NM. And the same things were going on in Champions, although chicken wings wasn't fried like they were in Zambia. Nor were they serving, you know, ethnic soul food. But the drugs used in the selling was going on too. But the police strategy for the Zambezi Club was to go in and blame the club owner and close the club down, which had an economic impact on not only the neighborhood, but the club owner. But never once did they close down the Champion. Never once. Drug use in Champion was an individual responsibility or individual situation. But if it happened in the Zambezi Club, it was being condoned by the owner of the club, so therefore the whole club got closed down. These were intentional strategies that was taking place. In our juvenile justice system in the District of Columbia, believe it or not, and I know people like Tyrone and some of the rest of the guys, Courtney and them know that in our juvenile justice system, we have never ever had in the history of our juvenile justice system a white juvenile.
What?
That's exactly right.
That's true.
We have never ever had a white juvenile in detention or incarcerated in the old system of Oak Hill or in the new system of New Beginnings. And the reports have never ever reflected that there were a white person or white juvenile.
We got to arrest some white people.
We need to use the same policies.
No, that's exactly right. And what our chair said is exactly what the police officers would say, because they would say that race was not a factor, that they responded to the situation based on what they were confronted with. That's why what the brother said yesterday in terms of words and definitions, we really had to be careful about. Because there were black folk who, not only whites, but there were black folk who complimented the juvenile justice system in the District of Columbia for the work that it was doing in incarcerating young people. Because they saw young people as a threat themselves. Even more so than anybody else in our community. You know, it was reflected in the ACLU's report around disproportionality when it came to marijuana arrests. There are 7 campuses in Washington, D.C., college campuses. If you wanted to arrest somebody for smoking marijuana, all you had to do is go up there on one of them campuses every day, every hour, and you could just pick and choose. But the picking and choosing would be whites. But they went to Ward 7 and 8, where most black people lived, and the rest were in the excess of 80%, in the 80 percentile. And in the white wards, they were still arresting black people in the 80 percentile, yet whites made up the majority of over 80% of the people who lived in those wards. So race has always been a factor in policing. And it continues to be a factor. But of course, they're not going to tell you that. And I was sharing with Brother Kennedy that the way they do it is they use you, but you have to be careful how you ask for police service these days. And always had. You know, I think Brother Atkins, Darrell in North Carolina talks about this. You know, we need to get the police out of our community because they've been as devastating as the drug war in our community. Yes, but they've been a part of it too. Right. But they're even more devastating because we call the police. And that's a legitimate thing. But what we call them for, sometimes we can take care of ourselves. And if we call them, we will hear that again. Because the police community uses that term or that phrase to justify their over law enforcement related or oriented response to our community. The reason why we call the police is most of the time because we never ever get the quality of police service or public safety that we deserve in the first place. So when we're calling them, we want them to do the job that they do on the other side of town in the way that they do it on the other side of town. We ain't asking for them to lock up 95% of the people in our community just simply to justify that crime has gone down. Crime goes down without arrest, really. It really has. And it has gone down over the last 10, 15 years, 20 years even. And even though we have arrested more people, the arrests are questionable, number one. And you can see that any day in the arraignment part of the court. Because most people walk out who walk in that night before. Most of them walk out the next morning. So that questions the quality of the arrest. But it also questions whether or not if we move the police out of our community, we will lessen the impact of those arrests that take place on a catch-can kind of basis. And those arrests aren't the kind of crimes that are reflective in terms of quality of life stuff to start off with. Somebody getting arrested for a warrant or a traffic violation that happened 2 years ago has nothing to do with public safety on our block. But that's what they want us to believe. So not only are they using race as a factor, they're lying to us. If you believe it. So those are the kind of everyday things, but we need to pay attention more to it ourselves. And then I think, like Darrell talks about, adopt and develop strategies that move the police out of our business. I think we can do the kind of things. We have the people in our community that can do the kind of thing to lessen the impact. And then lastly, the kind of development that has taken place in our community. I wouldn't be at odds with any of the development that has taken place in most places. I grew up here in Baltimore, so there's a lot of things that I've seen here at home and other places that I think we can celebrate. But I know for a fact that I would have enjoyed and utilized a Best Buy at 14th and Park Road 30 years ago. 30 years ago, a Target. I would have appreciated that. I would have appreciated the credit union at 14th and Park Road too. Because there's one there now. Never been a credit union in the history of our city at 14th and Park Road. I'm telling you.
Still black community?
Well, part, but that's not the reason. But
right.
Oh, no, the reason why there's now a Best Buy there is because
well, the white
folks have moved.
The white folks have moved in. And I say all that to say that black folk would have appreciated the new development, the stores, the quality of the merchandise. They would appreciate the variety of the merchandise. They would appreciate that because see, we're still languishing in a hole from the results of the rise that took place in our community that the city decided that they wasn't going to invest in, that they just would allow to take place. That was part of the devastation. That was part of the leftover impact of, well, we're just going to let their communities, let those people stew in their conditions and all those kind of things. And what it did, though, was not only affect in terms of the economic thing, but it also affected the psyche of our people saying that, well, if we don't deserve this, we don't deserve anything else. So we internalized that process. And so we're now completely satisfied with living in those conditions because that's what we get. When the fact of the matter is they waited till the white folks showed up to even think about putting those things in our community. And then there's some of us who are somehow never satisfied with that and afraid to speak back to it. And we shouldn't be, because we shouldn't accept that. But again, that's part of the destruction that has taken place. And the value of it is probably, you can't probably put a dollar value on it, because it has not only just, it has affected our children, our schools, the whole 9 yards. We haven't, I know in our city and other cities, they are what they call modernizing schools in our communities, because they haven't invested in our schools in over 30 years. But they're not invested in our schools and fixing them up because our children deserve that, black children.
Right.
Because black children go to public school.
That's right.
They're doing that because in hope that white folk will send their children to public schools. Because if they're paying $3,000 a month for rent, they can't afford to send them to a private school that costs $3,000. Now some of them are financially able to do that, but most of them aren't. Or when they start thinking about that. But they're not doing that for us. They certainly aren't. So don't go to sleep yet. Wake up. Yeah. Just understand exactly what we can benefit from it though, because we need to be involved in that process. And yes, our schools need to be modernized, and we need to have the technology in our schools. But we need to be involved in that process and also determine whether or not how the schools are going to be used. Those schools belong to us and in our community. Those are our schools. They don't belong to the white people. They don't belong to the school system. They belong to the citizens who have paid tax dollars to prevent them. But all of that's also part of the devastation and the results of it that are taking place. Yes, ma'am. Can we just open it up for questions, and then we can get to the second part? Yes, ma'am.
In reference to policing, is it best practice, or do we really want to remove police out of our communities, or do we want police to police our communities like they do other communities? I ask this question because right now in Pittsburgh, we have a situation where law enforcement brought to my attention a video that these young men made in this particular area where there's a lot of murders, killings, and I found out that it's stemming from a rivalry between two so-called gangs between two areas. And so law enforcement brought to my attention this video, and they brought it to my attention just so everybody knows, because I have an organization that combats police brutality. And so as a justification or a way to get me to understand their police tactics or their police officers' state of mind of what they're dealing with, they brought this video to my attention that these young men made, where they have all these guns in the video, maybe like 15 of them. And they're in the video talking about a young woman that was murdered. And they are making fun of the fact because the person who murdered her, who is in prison, is from their crew. And so the video caused a lot of tension, of course, from the other side the young lady was attached to. It keeps this rivalry going. And so when you have that, and the video went viral on Facebook, okay, so when you have that, I'm caught in between people in our community saying these young men need to be locked up. These young men, they just need to get them out. I'm talking to other individuals who are talking to this young man, and I talked to them myself. I sought them out and found them, who say that they don't listen. They don't, they had black men in their life pouring into them and, trying to talk to them, not listen, so they're up in arms. And then you have law enforcement saying, this is what we have to deal with. These young men have these number of guns. This is why our law enforcement sometimes overreacts or overresponds, because we had 3 officers shot, and this is the reality of what we deal with. So when you're caught in between those two conversations, and you have people in your own community advocating for this, the cleaning of the young men just being cleaned out, how do you address or echo a message to remove police out of the community and think anybody's going to buy into that?
Well, it's an ongoing process. It's not something that takes place overnight. You have to really work on that process. When I say take the police out, I mean take them out in the context of reducing the calls to them for issues that we can handle ourselves. Amen. Utilizing the resources in the community. I can give you Tyrone Parker's address, and email address, and all that stuff, because they work with young men in gangs and crews, and they develop truces. They do all those kind of things. recognizing the resources in our community and working on them sort of reduces the demand on it, so that when we have to call the police, they have the resources to come and apply those resources without using excessive tactics, because we have utilized other resources in the community that go to the foundation of those issues. Those young men need the kind of attention that Tyrone Parker or Stuart Courtney can give them that they've had success with, because they have a track record in doing that kind of stuff. So that backs the police out of it. And yes, if some of them need to go to jail, we know that they'll be able to go to jail. But the collateral effect of others going to jail that didn't have anything to do with it will not happen, but then leave us with an ability to be able to handle the situations in our community. We can apply the resources that Mr. Braswell and them had in doing the kind of work that they're doing with that. Because see, the police, like Yolande was talking about, the police don't really care about our children. They don't think that they don't care about. They ain't coming in there to give you care. They're coming in there to lock you up. That's their mentality. So, but we want somebody to deal with what the fundamental issues are. So we have to identify the individuals to do that. So in doing that, then we back them out, and they won't be using criminal justice as the first in the first case. When I was in school, I remember my professor saying that the system was set up in a way that we utilized in the old days, that is, and that may be the problem, that we utilize the criminal justice system as the institution of last resort. That when the church, family, all those other institutions fail, then we would use the criminal justice system. Well, in the last 30 years, that's changed. Criminal justice, now when we have a problem, the first thing we do is say, take them down to the jail. And we know that that hasn't worked because it's been, there's no proof that it has worked. All we've done is lock our children up for longer sentences. There are no services in there. We can't help them, and it hasn't worked. So now what we need to be doing, and Darrell Atkins in North Carolina is applying this strategy in the pilot program in Raleigh to do just that. But there's an investment that the community has to make in order for this to ultimately take place. Utilizing the resources, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the host of other people who are there. Social workers, you're absolutely right.
Well, it's the natural resources that are in that community.
Right.
Ron,
Yes, sir.
just real quick.
Yeah.
You mentioned the 3 officers. If you're talking about the incident I'm talking about, that's what the police were talking about. That was a white boy supremacist that shot them 3 police. You mentioned like the police is one of their arguments about why they got to do what they do. With the guns on the street, they said we had 3 police officers shot. That was a white supremacist. One of the black boys shot that way. Them 3 cops.
Oh, yeah, but he was the one that three down mentioned that. I don't know why it wasn't publicized. One's in a wheelchair, one has his fingers missing, and it was something else.
Well, in terms of the language, though, I mean, one time years ago, I was interviewed about that. That's an initiation to shoot police, and I said, one, that's an urban myth. I said, it's not true, and if it is true, we're doing a bad job because it's the police 50. I mean, black people 50 and the police 0. We ain't shooting nobody. We get shot. So,
But you
what
can't.
are y'all talking about?
See, you can't use as an excuse the way I treat young people today is based on the fact that a police officer got shot and killed 10 years ago. That don't hold any water. And so training and education and a whole host of other things ought to be utilized by the agencies that somehow or another repair that individual, and if they can't be repaired, then maybe they don't need to be a police anymore. If they don't understand that they have a responsibility related to what their job is. But more importantly, if we begin to identify and utilize the resources in our community, the natural result from that would be the backing out of law enforcement as well as other kind of government services, which you all have had some experience with anyway. The more our community steps up to the plate, the less demand it is on certain other kind of services, because those demands are upfront and intimate and personal, and they care more about providing the real services that people need in our community.
That's right. And also, just one thing, and they view you as a community asset, and one of the things that's important is being able to offer the alternatives, because if not, what you agreeing with them is sanctioning over surveillance of our communities, and and they think they see this community buying, that the community is okay with over policing troubled communities.
I just wanted to add on the issue of the criminal justice system as the first or the last resort. Let me be clear, white folk ain't calling the police on their children.
No, they're not.
They're not doing it. They will send their children to rehab, to dehab, to diversion, to anything before they are the ones that send their children into the criminal justice system. And that's the difference between the response of us, the community, but also the response of the police, because the police are coming into the white communities on a regular basis patrolling, and that is a different response too. And they're not always being called when there's trouble.
Yeah.
And so there's a certain sense of stability when you have the police in your white community visible on a regular basis and not just being called when there's trouble.
Can we start on this side and go down and then come around? Can we do that? So Tyrone?
You know, I think the value of this type of conversation here, it gives us the options to be able to look at it from the position that community workers are in, that possibly may not be totally familiar of the real resources that are in that particular community, to be able to mobilize it. Because as we begin to rely on the police as our first line of defense, it creates a hostile attitude and disposition among our youth that's further filtered down into this particular piece. And it also creates the difference in the context of how we deal with our youth, you know, from the caring component aspects of it. So when we're able to have a rational conversation that's substantial, because as she says, what she stated, that there's a real reality on some of the things that's occurring with our community. We cannot deny that. But at the same time, we've got to look at practices that have been proven to be beneficial, that can come from our community.
You know, there's also been some very natural things that have taken place over the last few years in communities that were not these massive kind of funded programs that took place. There's a community, East New York in Brooklyn, for some time has been like the murder center of New York City. And about 2 years ago, East New York had a stretch of about 367 days without a murder or a shooting. And when the New York Times went in to figure out what was going on with that, they had funded a group of men who were from the community to patrol the community, people who everybody knew. But they were only funded for a year to do that. And 2 days after the New York Times reported that this particular community had gone almost a year without a murder, 3 murders, they were no longer funded, and 3 murders happened 3 days after that report was done. I remember some time ago, the FOI was deployed to, I believe it was Baltimore, that they came into a housing complex in Baltimore. And the same scenario happened. These brothers were in the community, they were patrolling the community, they were protecting and respecting women, taking care of children, and the murder rate and crime rate just plummeted down to almost 0 in that community. And then the third one is there's an organization out in St. Louis called the Center for Fathering. And they have a program called Watchdogs. And Watchdogs is a program designed to bring men back into particularly middle schools where our young boys begin to start feeling themselves and getting in trouble. And what they're finding is they didn't bring these men back into the schools to be school crossing guards or security guards or hall monitors or any of those things. They deployed these guys back in the school to read to them, to be volunteers, to be coaches, and what the program is designed to is to increase the presence of men in the school. And as a result of the increased presence of men in the school, deviant behaviors have decreased. Kids are doing better in school. There's not the amount of chaos that's taking place with fights and stuff in school. And so I put that on the table as an example, not the thing that's going to fix it all. But it really speaks to, I think we all have been talking about how we can do very simplistic and simple things in our community using resources that already exist and deploying people who want to do something but don't know what to do and how to do it. And I submit to you that for most of the men, particularly mentors, that do not mentor, they do not do it because they're not asked. they're asked in promos and PSAs and those kinds of things, but no one walks up to the brother next in church and says, listen, what are you doing on Saturday? And he says, I'm doing nothing. You say, well, why don't you come with me over to the school? Because I go over to school and we have a really good time. And after we do what we do with the boys or what we do with the girls, we go and we watch the game afterwards. There ain't no guy that's going to say, you know what? Nah, that's an excuse for me to get out the house. I can go do something good, and then I can go hang out and do something I like. And I think that, you know, sometimes, you know, I like to bring us down, you know, to being able to figure out a way to start employing these kinds of very simplistic, natural things that has always been done in our community and bring it back to the forefront. And I'll end here. Oftentimes you hear people say, oh, I wish I could go back to the old days. I wish I could go back to the old school. Well, there's some things in the old days I don't want to go back to. You know, I hear you, but I don't want to go back all the way to the old days. Well, let's go back to the old days and find out what really worked naturally for our communities and begin to get back to the simplicity of what we know works for our communities.
I just, real quick for clarity, that is something that we are instituting, is having men walk the streets in this particular neighborhood from 10 at night to 1 in the morning. And the reason I had that conversation with law enforcement is because I wanted to make sure our guys would be involved. We have a serious issue there in that neighborhood. So I was making sure that our guys would be free. And we were talking about how we would be able to, they would be able to identify them so they wouldn't jump out, because we're going to be standing with guys who possibly are just smoking marijuana because they're just going to them directly on the street. But the reason my question was because to get the community support in our efforts. You had people who had lost children. You had people who, you know, are advocating for the law enforcement way that look like us, and who are just tired of all of the murders and all of the loss. And so I was looking for languaging and to, you know, convince them or to build their support of looking at a different way. And so, you know, it's being caught in between those conversations when you're caught in the middle and you're having law enforcement say this, and you have our communities agreeing to be able to shift that conversation and help them see a new way. So that's what my question is really here towards.
You know,
Mr. Vince?
yeah, I think sometimes when we have propaganda coming from one side, we have to have propaganda coming from the other. You know, when we come to meetings and people say, we got this happening in Texas and North Carolina, what's not privy to the normal community is to have that kind of information to counter. You know, that may be what the police are asking for, but this is what we've done in other communities, and we can do it here, that we can emulate. And I think that it's important that we begin to use the media as much as everybody else. Propaganda is propaganda. That's right. And we have to have it on both sides.
Right. Pastor.
I'm just enjoying everything, but I agree with my dear brother. In our region in Delaware County, which is just right outside of Philly, of course the heroin epidemic is just skyrocketing. It's always been in the white community, but now they cannot conceal it. So they have now tasked, and this is through advocacy, which is what we're all talking about, activism and advocacy. They're passing a bill now called the Good Samaritan Law. Yes. And which means if you're getting high, of course, if you're not like us, if you're using heroin or any other substance, if you call 911, the police show up, you can't be arrested. Right. You have to go to drug court, you have to get treatment. They're also considering arming law enforcement officers with the antidote. This is shoot up your nose to bring you back, to try to save your life. And this only because that element, they know they use advocacy, they use activism, they approach the policymakers and the lawmakers. So that's why I'm so excited about what our dear counselor is doing in June. And a lot of times we internalize our frustration. So I'm an activist pastor. I'm getting people active in, if you feel you've been racially profiled, this is what you do. If you feel you have an unjust sentence, this is what we're going to do. So I think that it's about all of us using our collective wills and spirits and gifts and talent and intellect to teach our people about advocacy. I was at a demonstration in Delaware County related to COINTELPRO. The FBI's chief office for COINTELPRO was in a little town called Media, right outside of Philadelphia. and it was the 43rd anniversary of the break-in. And we were there with all these quote-unquote activists and social justice people, but it's predominantly white. And there was some ACLU, I want to talk to my good sister from the ACLU, because I haven't met any people of color yet from the ACLU in the Philly office, and I work with them, I don't talk about that, but even in that process,
Director in Pennsylvania.
okay, thank you, even in that process, you see a stratification. We're all out there celebrating this break-in, we're celebrating the truth tellers and the freedom fighters, but there's always a stratification because they have the organization and the advocacy and the money. We have the passion and the experience. So I think that I'm really excited about what can come out of this, but it's still even just us, even when we're saying we're seeking advocacy and justice.
I'm going to get Ronell and then we'll come across, okay? All right.
So, I'm listening and, you know, so the first thing I want to talk about is, like...
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
I want to talk about, like, movement building, and I'm hearing everything, and, you know, I'm a sewer. You know, if you violate me, or if you break the law, or if I feel if I feel I've been treated unjustly, then, you know, I try to turn that around on you. You know what I'm saying? You got to abide by the same laws that I do. And as far as I'm concerned, you talking about genocide, and you talking about a whole nation of people, and, you know, there's world courts, and there are some things that we can do to build this movement around, you know, reparations. And I think that, you know, I'm sorry that all these things are happening in neighborhoods and communities, but the reality is we got to think up here as this table of people. That's what I'm here for. I'm here to try to figure out collectively, nationally, what are we going to do to stop this, to bring this to the forefront. And I understand that we got to talk about these little things. I do. And they're not little things, but, you know, we own HUD multifamily housing in Pittsburgh, like hundreds of units. We had to hire our own police force. We had to put our own stop signs up. We could completely govern our properties. We can push them all the way out. Every now and then, we even work with the police department to make sure the people in our neighborhood don't get arrested. But the reality is, until we at least acknowledge and ask them to, not ask them, make them pay for what they've done to us, then our young people, I mean, as far as they're concerned, we have deserted them. We have abandoned them. And we have to stand up and say, well, for me, you know, these are the crimes that you can be committed against me and my people, and this is what we need, and this is what we want. And I don't know, you know, the politics of the national or international courts, but what I know is there's been a crime committed against our people, and that as leaders, we got a responsibility to stand for them and to say, you did wrong by us, and this is what we intend to do. And you need it. Sorry.
But no, that I know for a fact that that's not lost on us. The second portion of our discussion in a minute is going to be about where we go from here. And Sister Nkechi has already talked about, and I've been in the audience at several presentations, and she has talked about this whole idea of like genocide and whatnot. So that's something that we
it's
can
not
talk
just at that level. Right now in Pittsburgh, we are like, I'm suing the city of Pittsburgh because they misappropriated federal dollars, CDBG dollars, and they do it in every neighborhood across the country. But, you know, we don't understand and we don't stand up. So I'm just saying there are things that, and you can't believe how much attention and how many young people we have attracted to our movement in Pittsburgh because, you know, they see it as standing up. And they, y'all doing something about it. We want to get them. I mean, you got to have tangible things that people can grasp on and have some hope for.
Okay. We're going to get to that. Okay. Let me start on this side.
Because it seems like we stay in the problem. That's all I'm going to say.
Andrea?
I just wanted to piggyback off of Nick. Do you want to go back? I just want to piggyback off of a very, very, very important point that both Nkechi and Yolande raised. And Nkechi quoted the CEO of CCA, the crime bill was very profitable to us. And then Yolande, and I don't want us to miss it, and I'm not suggesting that we did, but I just wanted to highlight this because this is absolutely important, talked about the importance of state action, policy, and legislation. So as we've traveled around and organized it for the Free Her rally, what we've done is we've gathered information in every state and city that we've gone to about policy and legislation that they're working on, in trying to find ways to learn for ourselves what we could do in Massachusetts because of that very reason. When Nkechi said the CEO of CCA talked about the crime bill was very profitable, the CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, is one of the corporations that funds and sits at the private prison table of the American Legislative Exchange Council. And the American Legislative Exchange Council was and continues to be responsible for drafting model legislation and infiltrating it through states throughout the country that has been responsible for everything from mandatory minimum sentencing, voter disenfranchisement, stand your ground laws, disenfranchisement of education. I mean, all of these things that we need to start countering by doing the same thing, which is what we're trying to do. Dr. Daniels, maybe through IBW, we can begin to create that database of legislation that states are doing. We're working on no bail jails right now in Massachusetts. We've convened the pretrial working group. And to hear that there's a state, New Jersey, that has filed legislation, we need to go and find out what that is and do it right now because we're right at the beginning of working on that issue. And if we replicate that and all of the things, repealing sex for fee cases, repealing all these things, the driver's license forfeiture when you have a drug conviction case. These are things that the ALEC has proliferated throughout the country that devastates our communities. And we have to begin to share those remedies, those legislative and policy remedies with each other and simultaneously be hitting on the state level with those things.
We have about 10 minutes, about 7 minutes for a few more questions, and then we're going to go to where do we go from here. So, the young man had
yeah, and maybe this is something that you guys are going to address in the second part, but like what I was wondering about, like I'm thinking a lot about like Angela Davis's work and like prison abolition, and like asking the question of like what reform looks like, and what does prison reform look like, and is the system, is it possible to have a humane prison, and like is it possible, like what do you guys see
No.
Right, yeah, so like what so like what, how do you guys envision kind of prison reform? Do you think we have to move away from the prison system in general? Like where do you guys stand on the abolition question?
Can that be a question that we raise in the next session? Yes. Because I think that's an excellent question. Excellent discussion question. Why don't we do that? Okay, we'll just move to part 2. All right. So why don't we start with Nkechi again, and then we'll go right into part 2. Where do we go from here? We've had the discussion. We've laid out the issues, the devastation. We've talked about that, and plenty of examples. So where do we go from here?
Okay, well, I want to start out with a little background because we're going to kind of dovetail with Jesslyn. But you know, in her book, Michelle Alexander talked about what she called nervous laughter. I don't know if you all remember that. Yeah. Nervous laughter, what she called the tendency to not take seriously innovative methods of thinking about issues at the juncture of race and justice. For example, she said a remark suggesting that the war on drugs might be the racist conspiracy to put blacks in their place invariably is accompanied by nervous laughter. Nobody wants to hear the word conspiracy, okay? Intended to convey the impression that although the the idea might have crossed their minds that it might be a conspiracy, it was not an idea that a reasonable person would take seriously. And I'm very familiar with this phenomena of nervous laughter. I remember during the early 90s when I was at the ACLU, but actually I was working with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights on what we called at that time the Voter Bill. It was the National Voter Registration Act, where you take the concept of when you go and get your driver's license, you can get your voter registration thing at the same time, et cetera, where I innocently, we're talking about the early 90s, raised the issue of voting rights for formerly incarcerated people. Now, this was before the issue of felony disenfranchisement became a household term, and trust me, it did not pass the laugh test. There was a lot of nervous laughter, really, and this was around a table of progressive, okay? So when I talk about the issues of genocide, I know it is accompanied by this nervous laughter. Again, despite the fact that you have an international convention, the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, that is what it is called, despite the fact that you can take each one of those elements that I talked about, that was the definition of genocide, and really apply them methodically and scientifically to each aspect. We'll just use the criminal justice system as an example, though you could use the healthcare system, you can use the education system, you can use the repression against blacks struggling for liberation. You can use all of those in the context of genocide, but just in terms of the criminal justice system, it, really does in fact fit. So my sister, although I'm not talking about specifically, we need to go to the International Court, we need to go to Geneva or anything, all I'm talking about is let's just make it part of the nomenclature, make it part of the discussion. My God, I am so glad, Yolande, that Michelle Alexander is raising the issue of reparations, because she has served to mainstream what many of us have been talking about for decades. Right. New Jim Crow first came up at one of the DPA conferences, I remember. I was on panels with Deborah Small and all that. We were talking about these issues decades ago. But Michelle very brilliantly and eloquently just brought it together in a book that garnered just widespread mainstream support. So now these things are becoming household words, and I'm glad she's using reparation in the context of criminal justice system. But trust me, there are many other systems that concept needs to apply to as well. So when 2002 came around and I started working with the Open Society, and we were looking at issues dealing with formerly incarcerated people, and OSI have been doing lots of funding of think tanks and all like that around the issues of reentry. This was during a time when reentry really hadn't even been entrenched as a term in and of itself. But we began looking at the legislative angle, and what can be done. There was no movement going on legislatively in terms of that. And I remember the original bill that we had written up and proposed had fixes to all of the different collateral consequences, whether it was in housing or in education or public benefits or franchise. It was all within that. It ended up, all of that got stripped out, okay? But what ultimately passed was the Second Chance Act, which provided funding for all of these great programs and mentorships and, all of that, but it really did not specifically touch the collateral consequences, many of which are state-based, of a criminal conviction. But it was, in fact, a victory because it was something that could be used to build upon. And again, that ended up being the Second Chance Act, fully entrenched now within the Department of Justice. There's a reentry council, et cetera, et cetera. But then we had in 2010, again, another issue we have been working on for decades. These things don't just fall out of the sky and happen to pass. There's a lot of groundwork and seed work. There's a lot of this thing where you have to advance innovative stuff and people don't take you seriously and call you a radical. Right. But it's all of that seeding that takes place before, and many people did not consider it a victory, so let me just caution you with that, with the 2010 Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the disparity between crack and powder cocaine from 101 to 18 to 1. I remember in 1994 with the crime bill, we were dealing with the issue of crack versus powder, and there were rebellions in the prison because they thought that the crime bill addressed the issue. All it did was call upon the sentencing commission to study the issue. They didn't understand that. They thought it was a unanimous vote. So it appeared as if the issue had been, fixed, but it had not. That was 1994. It was not until 2010 that we finally got the modicum of lessening of the disparity. But guess what? Many people don't realize it didn't touch the thousands of people who already were incarcerated upon that law. The thousands of people whose egregiously long sentences in and of themselves were the inspiration that led to something must be done about this disparate sentencing between crack and powder cocaine, because it was not retroactive. And Jesslyn knows very well that if we had pushed the envelope at that time to make it be retroactive, we would have gotten nothing. So it's a stage, and it's a process. So it was incremental. So it was at that time, after that passage, after that was done, beginning to think, well, what is it that can be done with these huge class of people who are still languishing in prison? Sentenced under the old law, but they don't get benefit of the new law because it was not retroactive. So we just did some creative thinking and looked back in history in the past to the Ford administration during the time when there was the issue in this country of what to do about all these Vietnam War people who resisted the draft and are incarcerated under this law, very unpopular law. What can be done? And what Ford did was he established a commission, a clemency board commission, to look at these cases and to just cut their sentences, commute their sentences, those that were applicable and applied, and said, well, we can take that concept and use it to today with respect to these old crack cases. So we had meeting upon meeting with the White House and meeting upon meeting with the DOJ, and it basically was an inside the Beltway, Washington-based insider type strategy, because sometimes you don't want to quite go all out with all of everything, because then it's harder to get action. So that was our strategy. What just happened, I'm not going to get too much in detail because I'm going to let my colleague kind of cover some of the specifics in the weeds, but when Jesslyn talked about it at the end of 2013, Obama commuting 8 crack cases, that was a bellwether. That was to see what, if any, backlash was going to come from him opening up the doors to try to do some type of fix, to these cases. So when it was found out that there wasn't a huge backlash, the conservatives weren't jumping up on their bandstands and saying bad president. They were saying bad president on everything else, but it really didn't hit it with respect to this. So about a month or so ago, the Deputy Attorney General basically said, bring us the cases. Bring us the cases. And Andrea, she's going to tell you what the criteria and all like that, but bring us the cases. But when Jesslyn talks about the criteria that they're using for some of these cases, I want us to still think innovatively and think out of the box. Because a lot of the people that might in fact benefit from the unrolls that are being made to try to ameliorate some of the gross injustices in sentencing in the past might not fit within the criteria. Does that necessarily mean that they should not also be home with their family members and their friends? So I just want to conclude by saying that it is important that everybody has a seat at the table. This comes out of Andrea James' book, Upper Bunkers Unite. She talks about seat at the table. In the 90s, we did not have, when I say we, I ain't even talking about formerly incarcerated people. I'm just talking about black folk in general who deal with policy issues. Really, well, excuse me, there might have been one seat at the table. I might eat it, and then Warren came around with 2 seats. But there was not, it was the exception, rather than the rule. So, when I look around the Justice Roundtable, which is the policy coalition in Washington today, and even juxtapose that to what it was back when we first started it in 2002, there's a sea change in terms of who is at the table. With respect to the Open Society, with respect to Drug Policy Alliance, with respect to the grants and fellowships that are given out, you don't see a lot of foundations out there funding people who just got out of prison. Right. Okay. Open Society is doing that. Drug Policy Alliance is doing that. We're kind of planting seeds so that other foundations are comfortable, okay, and see the benefit, and not just the benefit, the necessity that when we deal with policy issues, people who are directly impacted by those policies have to have a place at the table to express viewpoints. We can't just always be up on the ivory tower and dictating from above. Everybody needs to be part and parcel of making those decisions.
So just a couple of things I want to respond to in the context of conversation around where we go from here. I just want to make sure that people heard when the pastor was talking about heroin, and that you picked up that the response to heroin, because the people that are addicted to heroin are white, is different than the response to other drugs, because the perception is the people that are dealing and using, I'd say perception, not always using.
Use the mic.
Use the mic. The perception of people who are using and dealing other drugs is that they are black. So the response to heroin was treatment, not the first response of the criminal justice system in terms of arresting